Thank you, Buford. Well, hello. It is time for a hot take, and I think it is simply that Titanic is good, actually. James Cameron is a very specific type of genius that all nerds kind of wish they were, and I imagine that is why so many people are so eager to hate this guy, eh? And not just because of his not-so-secret reputation of being a tremendous asshole. And I'm going to demonstrate this particular brand of genius by drawing a comparison to, of course, what else? Phantom of the Opera. No, no, please don't leave. I swear this isn't a bait and switch about Phantom. I'll keep it short. A good production of Phantom of the Opera will have you responding to the actors, as is the case with the 25th anniversary cast, and the chemistry between the actors nearly sucking their souls out of each other's bodies from the sheer intensity of it, more than the flashy set pieces. This lays in contrast with the most recent and umpteenth time I saw Phantom on Broadway earlier this year for me podcast, where the cast was so lacking in everything that the biggest reaction/applause from the audience were for the set pieces, not for the actors. The audience applauded for the chandelier, they applauded for some of the stunts and the badly aged pyrotechnics, but for the actors it was more of an applause of obligation, if at all. In fact, there was hardly even a standing ovation, and I never see begrudging standing ovations at Broadway shows anymore, at least in the before time. And if they enjoyed the spectacle, that's fine, that's whatever. But if they didn't connect with the actors, if they didn't connect with the performers, then that's not going to make the thing stick with people. Which brings us to Titanic, a film so wrapped up in spectacle. It's kind of hard to imagine that James Cameron had any room in his brain for anything but spectacle. But people came for the spectacle. They did not stay for the spectacle, they stayed for the story, the characters, the je ne sais quoi, the iconic love story. This requires a skill, and it is iconic. The film still lives strong in our lexicon, the memes immortal. Kate Winslet, DiCaprio perfectly fine. We have no choice but to stand. No choice but to have ouch. Compare Titanic to Avatar, which despite what the Walt Disney Company would have you believe. Would ye why the people that have do wait now everyone, including me, who has ever dreamed of visiting this extraordinary world, can explore its astonishing landscape. Usually, sublucids, a lukewarm me from people when you bring it up, except for dads. Maybe they remember like the special effects or the Threed or Bill Wellington. Chris Cumberbatch, you know, that guy that was in the movies in 2010. But there's not much memorable about the story itself. When people think about Avatar, they think of the technology upon which it was hyped. And then they probably make a blue Pocahontas joke. There are those who are kind of into the world-building elements, I think. I can't tell how ironic this is, and I actually know her. But no one is terribly invested in the story of Jake, Sully, and Neytiri. But with Cameron, up until his slip really started to show with Avatar, he was very good at balancing spectacle with story, but up until Titanic, usually giving the edge to spectacle, because that seemed to be more where his interests lie. In the case of Titanic, it was the biggest spectacle in cinematic history. But at the end of the day, the story is what remains. It is what sticks with people. Cameron has done this before by turning his love of deep-sea diving into the 1989 film, The Abyss. A lesser-known Cameron joined about deep-sea aliens, but that fixation on deep-sea diving leapfrogged eventually into a fixation on the newly rediscovered Titanic in the 1990s. Cameron spent a ton of his own fortune on diving in Titanic stuff. And, I've always been interested in the ocean. So there was a certain transition point where I realized I was heading toward making a film on that subject. And before long, like so many YouTubers after him, he looked at his greatest interest and thought, hey, I could monetize this. Turn down for what? And so monetize it he did, with one of the most expensive, remarkable, and memorable movies of all time, Titanic. I am thinking of the world. Who? But the remarkable thing about Titanic within the Cameron canon, the first thing that people think about is not the spectacle, alas the alien queen in Aliens or the Minnesota 1000 in Terminator 2, but for better or worse, it is the characters, the story. They think about, draw me like one of your French girls. They think about, I'm flying. They think about, I'm the king of the world. About, it's been 84 years. They think of putting the diamond in the coat and putting the coat on her. The story still trumps the spectacle in the cultural canon, which is why it's so odd to me that creeping up on a quarter century later, there are so many people still insisting that Titanic is bad, actually. But I'm not just here to argue that Titanic is good, actually. Oh no, I am here to argue that Titanic is actually one of the greatest cinematic achievements in history, that it did deserve all of the awards and acclaim. And no, it did not deserve that big, dumb, stupid, giant backlash, one of the biggest ever and one of the most influential. A backlash so fierce that never again would the popular thing be allowed in the same paddock with the high art thing. No Best Picture nomination for you, Dark Knight. A segregation of pop art and high art so severe that the Academy eventually had to expand the Best Picture category back out to 10 nominations because could we please get some popular stuff nominated again? Please. So following in the footsteps of those intrepid divers alongside James Cameron who rediscovered the wreckage of the great ship, I am here to dive down and rescue Titanic's reputation as a cinematic great before it gets eaten by the iron-eaten bacteria of this incredibly mixed metaphor. Titanic is one of those movies that, when I feel like people try to articulate what they don't like about it, they tend to be grasping at straws or declaring certain elements to be subpar when I'm like, am I missing something? Did we watch the same movie? This is fine. Like Leonardo DiCaprio's acting, for instance. It's a perfectly fine use of your DiCaprio. With all due respect, miss, I'm not the one hanging off the back of a ship here. We know what bad DiCaprio looks like. And your love has meant nothing to either of us. No, no. Watch them. First of all, my own brother's trying to do this tone. Surrender now. No. Wear it until you love it. This is not bad DiCaprio. The basis of most of the criticisms seems to be based on story is simple or characters are simple or woe, such melodrama. But that said, Titanic is about as complex as any other mass-appeal blockbuster. Neither its characters nor its writing are remarkable in this regard compared to other movies. Same with the characters. Are you off the Boston Dawsons? No, the Chippewa Falls Dawsons. No, the Chippewa Falls Dawsons actually. Oh yes. Jack Dawson gets more backstory than generally agreed upon good characters like everyone in Jurassic Park. What's your backstory, Alan Grant? We're going to find out why you don't, kids. Oh wait, who cares? It doesn't matter. And then there's the criticism that the film is melodramatic, which I also find odd because the melodrama of the situation is why we remember the Titanic disaster at all. It was the largest moving object in the world built by human hands at the time, as well as the apex of Edwardian glamour. It was to be the captain's last voyage before he retired, and the ship sank on its maiden voyage. Any publisher would throw that concept out for being way too over the top if it had not actually happened. It is a fundamentally melodramatic historical event, so there's not really anything tonally off about having a big emotions romantic epic on board the ship right before it sinks. Simplicity, likewise, is a fine line to walk. A storyline might feel simple after you've watched a movie 400 times, but one must also consider how a story lands to a first-time audience, as well as repeat viewers. Not to be that guy, but now that, like, but nah, I'm a writer now. But after I sold my first book, available July 21st, pre-order link in the description, a huge component of the revisions were simplifying the mysteries what get revealed and clarifying world building and plot elements that I had thought were pretty clear, but were reading as confusing to first-time readers like me editor and me literary agent. So simplicity and clarity is harder to do than you might think, and more complex does not equal more good. In the case of Titanic, the main love story, star-crossed lovers of different class who meet, fall in love, and then one of them dies is fairly simple, in the same way that Romeo and Juliet is fairly simple if you reduce it to its core components. I defy you stars. But it has to balance its bulk with a bunch of other subplots, both with tying the two mains and with the fate of the ship itself. So the film needs to walk a fine line. Spectacle versus emotional core, melodrama versus absurdity, sincerity versus irony, and all the while appeal to as many people as possible. Cameron himself described his script as intentionally incorporating universals of human experience and emotion that are timeless and familiar because they reflect our basic emotional fabric. And all the while I feel I'm standing in the middle of a crowded room screaming at the top of my lungs and no one even looks up. In response to the accusation that the film is cliché, Cameron said, "La Times critic Kenneth Turin mistakes archetypes for cliché. I want to share his view that the best scripts are only the ones that explore the perimeter of human experience or flashily pirouette their witty and cynical dialogue for our admiration. You drop this, King. It's from a masterpiece. Starscream, it's the only crown I have. And of course the mere audacity of that attempt is a strike against the movie's favor. It's trying to be populist trash. Which leads us to another common criticism, that the film is too base. The swill of the common folk. Like that is a bug and not a feature. There is a sort of classism inherent to criticisms like this. In effect, it's too many people like this, which one sees reflected in the criticism that Cameron's Titanic valorizes the third class and demonizes the first class. My favorite bad Titanic take comes from historian Richard Davenport Hind, who wrote, "Cameron's film diabolized rich Americans and educated English, anathematizing their emotional restraint, good tailoring, punctilious manners, and grammatical training, while it made romantic heroes of the poor Irish and the unlettered." Whoa! But the thing about popular and low art is that given enough time, history often reframes it as high art. Shakespeare, Puccini, Dickens, even the novel itself, all started off as popular art that only got reframed as high art in retrospect. So popular art that hits with a wide audience, difficult to do, but popular art that stands the test of time, even harder. There's truth, but no logic. What's the artist's name? The artist. It's Something Picasso. Even Empire magazine originally gave the film 5 stars, then later revised it down to 4 after the backlash, and then eventually revised it back up to 5 when they realized that they were basically peer pressured into giving it a bad review. So I feel like the eagerness that some film people have to distance themselves from Titanic isn't really out of a desire to assess the quality or impact of the film, but to tiptoe around the backlash that followed it. And even if you re too young to remember the backlash, you can still probably feel it in the atmosphere. Like saying that one of the most successful movies in history is good, actually, is odding against your credibility. Are the masses really that stupid that if they like the thing, it must be because the thing is bad, actually? Well, if one must descend into the trash pile in order to admit that we enjoy the thing, then this is where we live now. So we not going outside anytime soon. Why this shipwreck? You know, why not the Lusitania? Why not the Morro Castle? Why not the Atlantic? I mean, you've got, you know, the biggest ship in the world. It's on its maiden voyage. You've got the president of the company on board that owns it. You've got the builder on board. And it hits an iceberg, and it sinks so slowly that you've got all these hours for all this drama to be acted out. But there's way more to it than the drama of it all. The time period in which it happened is also, of course, relevant. The Edwardian era, and yes, this counts, was the last before the advent of modern warfare. With World War I came all of this senseless death and carnage. Then World War I, where a solid 3 of all of humanity died. Then the nuclear age. And, of course, the sword of Damocles that hangs over us to this day, climate change. So it's almost like a simpler world went down with the boat. A more civilized world, a more glamorous world. It's always oversimplifying to say it was a simpler time or a more innocent time, but that is kind of what it felt like. Similar to Downton Abbey, which basically captures the last gasps of aristocracy before World War I in England. Do we know anyone on board? Your mother knows the Astors. At least she knows him. Titanic does the same. Yes, class stratification and inequality are still major things today, but there's no glamour to the social lives of, like, Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates. So you re-saying you teach them that they have chores. Yeah, they have chores. Your kids have chores. Yeah, they have responsibilities. They have chores, they have responsibilities. Now flaunting your wealth is what the kids call a bad look. Cameron was far from being the first or only person to wring the entertainment potential out of this tragedy of errors. In fact, it was only weeks after the ship sank that studios around the world began producing dramatized films. One notable being the silent short saved from the Titanic, released a cool 29 days after the shipwreck and starring a survivor of the disaster, Dorothy Gibson. But the heyday for the Titanic dramatization came in the 1950s. There was a 1953 Barbara Stanwyck film simply called Titanic, which is a wildly inaccurate, fanciful piece of fan fiction. River, why don't you be River, why don't you be River, why don't you be, but hey, you know, it made money and walked away with the Best Screenplay Oscar. And it paved the road for A Night to Remember, widely considered the more historically accurate of the bunch and easily the film with the greatest influence on Cameron's version. It's kind of like how Disney's Hunchback of Notre Dame is really more of a remake of the 1939 Hunchback of Notre Dame than an adaptation of Victor Hugo's novel. Hell, even the Nazis made their own propaganda version of Titanic. And this version took the narrative of Bruce Ismay, wealthy coward who survived, and turned him into an evil, greedy Jew who was also a coward that survived. Because of course they did. And as a side note, perhaps the person done dirtiest by history and dramatized versions of Titanic is Bruce Ismay, who was the highest-ranking official on board the Titanic who actually survived. And he's the guy in the movie he's pushing the captain to make the boat go faster. The person is the size of Titanic. Now we want them to marvel at her speed. In real life, Ismay was not the living embodiment of hubris. While Hay did get on the last lifeboat, he was not the last man on the Titanic. He was the last man on the Titanic. While Hay did get on the last lifeboat, there is little evidence to support that he actually ordered the Titanic to go faster. Most of the people who saw him on the boat actually testified that he helped save people and only hopped in the boat because there were no women and children around to take the space. And a lot of the Ismay hearsay was established by William Randolph Hearst, who hated Ismay. And Cameron knew this, so why include it? Well, because according to Cameron, people expected to see it. And so he's here in this role to play to people's expectations, to give them what they want. The 90s resurgence of Titanic interest most likely came about as a result of the wreckage being discovered. There was a miniseries from 1996 starring Catherine Zeta-Jones in a role quite similar to Rose. Just breathe, darling. Just show them you can breathe, darling. Just breathe, just breathe. There was a musical from 1997 called Titanic, a new musical written by Mary Yeston and Arthur Capet of Nine fame and this proto-Phantom. And while this musical swept a very low-energy Tony Award season, winning 5 awards including Best Musical, it ranks pretty high on my hunch the musical scale of musicals. Why, we got a hunch this is love. Love. It wasn't that historical movies were or were not particularly big in the 90s. For every Braveheart and Dances with Wolves, you had big disappointments like Far and Away and Cutthroat Iceland. And history is increasingly unkind to the former 2 examples. Why, we got a hunch this is love. Love Run, Kristen. I said run. John. But the more relevant context for which the period in which Titanic was made was period pieces. It was. Why, we got a hunch this is love. There are different cycles for nostalgia, and so far the ones we discussed that are relevant to Titanic have been 40-year cycles, with a big resurgence of interest in the 1950s and then again in the 1990s. But arguably the most consistently lucrative nostalgia cycle is the 20-year cycle, because generally this applies to a demographic who are, they reckon getting settled in life, getting married, having kids, buying houses. That was a thing people our age did in the 90s. And now they feeling wistful about their lost youth and they wanna go to the movies. Think of how Grease, a huge hit released in the 70s, was nostalgic for the 50s. You have your Brady Bunch and all sorts of sitcom remakes that were released in the 90s, nostalgic for the 70s. Sure, Jen. But also in the 90s we had the stylistic nostalgia cycle for disaster movies. In the 70s you had big hits like Towering Inferno and Earthquake. But in the 90s we had another resurgence, not only with natural disaster movies like Dant, Speak and Volcano, Deep Impact, Armageddon God, there were so many, but we also had like Alien Invasions, we had Independence Day, any manner of way we can almost wipe out human civilization. We were so bored in the 90s. And right now we on the verge of a 20-year cycle for the 2000s as well, which I intend on capitalizing shamelessly. Link in the description. It's a period piece. Titanic was pitched as Romeo and Juliet, but on the Titanic. But the danger there is then it looks like a movie for women's. Look, is it a boy movie or a girl movie? We have to choose. And I could go into the convoluted nightmare of the production of this movie and how all signs pointed to failure, but really that would deserve its own video. By virtue of the fact that Cameron was a proven hitmaker, studios gave him a lot more money and freedom than they would have to other directors, which is partially why Titanic is allowed to so completely inhabit both worlds, both shamelessly romantic and a textbook 90s disaster movie. But because the studio was capping costs, Titanic didn't have anything like the marketing push we see in big movies today. So a lot of its success really did kind of come by word of mouth. By all this outside, pal, all of you belong. And the fact that for the most part Hollywood failed to repeat the success of Titanic, and we owe debt to that, tells me that they never really understood why it was a success in the first place. I mean, attempts were made, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first, I would like to talk about. A lot of people joked at the time about who would want to see a Titanic movie because, we all know how it ends, right? So within the text of the film, the audience needs an incentive to engage with the story outside of simply knowing how it ends. See, previous Titanic movies or musicals just told the story as a period piece. But Cameron's film uses the modern day and a self-insert character named Bill Paxton as James Cameron's, if you will excuse the term, avatar. Meet Bill Paxton, played by Brock Lovett, our James Cameron insert who only cares about the money, not the science. He's in it for the money, not the science. He's in it for the glory, but doesn't really understand the heart of the tragedy. He doesn't get it. And that's where Rose comes in. She's going to tell her story, and then he's going to get it. Part of the reason Titanic was such a hit was because audiences were really staring for deeply sincere emotional content. But if you're going to go that route, you can't just bust in with a high melodrama. Look, it's the 90s, kids. We are all irony poisoned. The president is being impeached over politics air for suckers and nothing matters. But we are all deeply lonely. The success of Titanic kind of reminds me of Star Wars 20 years earlier. The 70s weren't as irony-poisoned as the 90s, but the trend definitely rejected old Hollywood simplicity or this epic tone that Star Wars was going for. The assumption was that audiences would be turned off by that approach, when in reality they were apparently starving for it. A cowboy movie is set in space. That's a Star Wars. It's old-fashioned, escapist entertainment, pure and simple, with no moral, no message. And it appears this is what just about everybody in the country is in the mood for. So Titanic's framing device is important in the context of a 90s movie in particular, because by allowing for all of this eye-rolling and we know it's a schmaltzy, but just roll with it. It's easier for the audience to suspend their disbelief or their irony in the case of the 90s and accept the story. It takes about 25 minutes to get through the framing device at the beginning. And not only does it leave no doubt as to how the story ends, we know the ship sinks before the story proper even starts. It also tells us the science of what is happening. So when the ship does sink some 2 hours later, you don't have the audience being like, what the hell, when it breaks in half or sinks vertically. The stern rises up, slow at first and faster until finally she's got her hull a sticking up in the air. But moreover, The thing about a Titanic movie is, I mean, the fact that we know how it ends means you have to have a new main tension rather than will the boat sink or not. Instead of will the ship sink, the narrative hooks are character-based. We know Rose survives, but how? And why has she kept her identity a secret? What happened to Jack? And where is that necklace anyway? In the context of the framing device, the necklace is what we call a MacGuffin. Is it a diamond? Yes. In simple terms, a MacGuffin is a thing that drives the plot, but it doesn't actually matter to the story. Everybody wants the necklace, because of course they do. It's a thing we can fight over. It's the reason Rose and Bill Paxton meet in the first place. But it doesn't actually matter to the story because the story is about Jack and Rose, not the diamond. Hence she throws it into the ocean at the end. But now you know there was a man named Jack Dawson and that he saved me in every way that a person can be saved. And it's a stuff like this that leads to a lot of really lame criticism because all we have to do now that it's the end times is logic the thing. Like in the making of this video, every time I tweeted about Titanic, I got like 400 ads about the door or headboard or whatever that thing is. Like, Jack could have fit on there too. They both could have fit on the head. Like, way to miss the point. Ashholes. Like there's even a really lame deleted scene where they address this. Just enough for this lady. We'll push it under. Let me try at least or I'll be soon. I so you will leave sooner. If you come any closer. You see, we, the audience, need to feel the weight of the loss here. Not just the 1,500 randos that died, but the character that we've come to know and care about for the last 3 hours. So Jack sacrificing himself is a micro version of what makes the story so remarkable. Any room for a gentleman? I don't need woman at this time, sir. Women and children first was an official policy by any stretch. It was not maritime law. It was more like the Pirates Code and Pirates of the Caribbean, more of a guideline. So while in theory in a disaster situation, the men folk would try to save the women and children first, the reality is that women and children were way less likely to survive shipwrecks. And in practice, it was usually every man for himself. The White Star Line's previous worst maritime disaster, the sinking of this Atlantic, lost more than half of its passengers when it sank and every single woman on board and all but one of the children died. So the fact that the majority of Titanic survivors were women and children is actually an extreme outlier. So Jack giving up his spot for Rose serves synecdoche for the greater sacrifice. He knowingly gives up his spot for her just as hundreds of others did. Cameron could have contrived any number of ways for Jack to give up his chance at life for Rose, but to get so obsessed with the logistics of the door and the buoyancy and the square footage, which is explained in the text. So to focus on that instead of the simple plot element of Jack sacrifices his life for Rose is to completely miss the point. If you want to contrive some other way for Cameron to have gotten this across, leave me a comment, boost my algorithm rating. I promise I'll read each one. Thank you for that fine forensic analysis, Mr. Bodine. Titanic is functionally two movies. In the first half, the Romeo and Juliet love story, and the second half, the action movie, which again should not work and is really difficult to pull off. But in practice, the first half serves to make the audience care about the thing, the ship, the people on it, the love story, and then the second half takes it all away. The two halves have completely different tensions. The first half being the will they want they get together, the second half being who will survive and how. To again quote Cameron, "You have to care about the ship in order to care about the sinking. I have built you a good ship, strong and true." The best case for what works about Titanic can be made by comparing it to its most blatant ripoff, Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor is a love story set against the backdrop of a major historical tragedy, in this case, a surprise attack that led to the U.S. entering World War I. There are more obvious ripoff elements. The score. It has a fun dance scene, both involve ship sinking. Also, where Titanic has Fabrizio. "Goodbye, I will never forget you. I go to America. I can see the Statue of Liberty already." Pearl Harbor has like 7 Fabrizios. Here Sa Fabrizio, there a Fabrizio, Black Fabrizio, Lady Fabrizio. But it's not what the movie takes from Titanic that makes Pearl Harbor such a failure. It's what it lacks. Pearl Harbor approaches its love story with the same logic as the clones from the original animated Dumbo approach, laughing. Yeah, if they laugh when he jumps 20 feet. They all laugh. Why's just hard if he jumps 40 feet. If you were rooting for these 2 crazy kids, how about these 3 crazy kids? Yeah, so love triangles are generally pretty frustrating narrative devices, especially if the narrative is serialized like in a show or a book series. You've gotta be kidding me. And when they do work incorporated in something short like a movie, it's where the choice is obvious. I feel this. I feel the pain. Yes, you are, and I will. It's not who will Rose choose, it's will Rose get away from the bad one. Again, the choice is simple, and in this case, simple is not bad. You jump, I jump right. In a movie, you just don't really have enough time to develop 2 relationships well enough to the point where it's like, oh whoa, I wonder who she'll choose Team Jacob. But the real difference between the romance in Titanic and the romance in Pearl Harbor goes back to the simple screenwriting question of want versus need, a motivating want that drives the plot and a character arc defining need. Again, for another example of simple is not bad, Michael Jordan wants to be a baseball player, and this is what serves as his character motivation in the first act of the film. But when, because of some space monsters, the only thing that can save the world is someone with mad basketball skills, he realizes that he needs to go back to basketball and that his true place is on the court. Now leave the baseball player alone. Man, you know he doesn't play basketball anymore. Michael, did you hear that? They don't think you can play the game anymore. There's only one way to find out. But at the beginning of Pearl Harbor, none of the main characters want for anything before they meet and fall in love, except for Ben Affleck. Stace you may be getting in the way of him becoming a pilot. I'm never gonna be an English teacher, but I know why I'm here, to be a pilot. And you don't dogfight with manuals, which is immediately resolved anyway. In Titanic, Rose is our point of view character, and she's the one who's really missing something in her life when the narrative begins. She is repressed. She is lonely. She is desperate to break free and feels like there's no way out until she meets Jack. And Manic Pixie Dream Jack helps her complete her character arc. But in Pearl Harbor, no one really wants for anything, let alone needs it. Kate Beckinsale has her girlfriends, Affleck and Hartnett have each other and their terrible Southern accents. I don't wanna teach loops and barrel rows, I wanna be a combat fighter. So no one is lonely or unsupported. No one is missing something critical in their lives that might be improved by having a soulmate. They read just attractive people who are attracted to whoever, I guess. I suppose the argument could be made for Beckinsale's character needing something after she thinks Affleck is dead and she falls head over ass into bed with Josh Hartnett. But it's like, personally, if I see someone filling the gap of their dead lover with his best friend, I mean, it's not that that can't be compelling content. It would make for some great Real Housewives drama. You fing whore. You fing whore. A guy in me fing ass. You fing whore. But I'm not watching this and going, oh man, I hope these crazy kids make it through the war. Like, as an audience member, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to feel here. But I just wanna know why. So throughout Pearl Harbor, the love story feels incredibly hollow. Nothing is at stake if they go back to their old lives. And for Beckinsale, it basically reads like, well, at least now we've got a spare for when one gets killed in action, which of course, unlike Rose and Jack, where there is real stakes to their relationship outside of, young love for both of them, but particularly for Rose. Sooner or later, that fire that I love about you, Rose, that fire is gonna burn out. But upon rewatch, the most remarkable thing to me about Pearl Harbor is that it completely drops the ball at the thing Titanic nails. We, the audience, don't really care about the ships. It was a symbolic strike, yes, but the Japanese at Pearl Harbor weren't attacking civilians, sailors, or soldiers. They were attacking the fleet, which is another thing I hate. The bombers going after civilians and the hospital. Okay, we're not gonna go there. So surely there must have been some way for the audience to really appreciate the grandeur of these boats before they get destroyed. Make us care about the fleet before you sink it. Get out. Pearl Harbor rips off Titanic just enough to be frustrating, but it misses what makes those elements in Titanic work, that it succeeds in making you care about the ship itself, and it makes you care about the love story in no small part because they are intertwined. When the ship docks, I'm getting off with you. So in light of the fact that Broadway is shuttered and will remain so for a long time, I saw Hadestown again recently for me podcast, and at the time, seeing it yet again, I felt kind of gratuitous, like I was being really extravagant. I don't need to do this, and I don't think I would have felt that way if I had known that there was about to be no more theater. But the thing I love the most about Hadestown is it's a story that, is brave enough to have a tragic ending, but also takes the time to really explore the appeal of stories with tragic endings. I hear that a VV being shown that's only not so coming the musical Hadestown is a retelling of the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. And if you aren't familiar with the myth of Orpheus, it ends tragically. But the remarkable thing about this musical is as you rewatching it, it invests far more in the love story than the original myth ever could, and by the end it makes you believe that, like Jack and Rose, those crazy kids might actually make it out this time. And if you know the myth, but this is your first time seeing the musical, it genuinely draws you in and makes you wonder, are they actually gonna change the ending? Because that's kind of where it feels like it's going. They don't. But there is more to Hadestown than the tragic ending. It uses that ending to demonstrate the narrative appeal of tragedy, and why certain stories get told and retold over and over again. A well-told tragedy appeals to the human desire to hope. And every time you watch Titanic, or hell, every time I watch one of those Titanic sinks in real-time simulations on YouTube, of which I have watched all of them, there's this part of you that sees the ship approaching the iceberg and goes like a calca, oh, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. Like even 23 odd years later, there's still tension there because you still kind of hope that this time they might get out of it. But even upon rewatch, you still feel that story tension. And you don't leave feeling upset because the tragic ending is a satisfying one. When Rose either goes to sleep or dies at the end, debate that, not the stupid door. And she is spiritually reunited with everyone who died on the ship. Gets me every time. We chose this topic as we were developing a different topic that was more topical, but also more heavy and a little too heavy considering the circumstances. What? And when we found ourselves much more drawn to wallowing in nostalgia than examining the current state of things, we thought, hey, maybe that's what the people need right now instead. The trash pile is where we live, and that's fine. But even still, this episode was difficult to write because writing about how a thing is good actually, especially one that nerds don't universally agree on, is surprisingly hard to articulate. And I think because, especially on YouTube, it puts you in a defensive position, and that in and of itself is harder to write. But more importantly, it's also what YouTube's algorithm recommends and what people want to watch. Bad content tends to get way more views. But moreover, you also opening yourself up to vulnerability and points of attack. As one example, and this is not even something I said on YouTube, I said a nice thing about someone else's book, a very popular and award-winning book at that, in an interview for Newsweek. And I saw in a Reddit thread saying that said book that I said the nice thing about was not good, actually. And if I say that the thing is good when, in fact, the thing is not good, then we can extrapolate that me book is probably also bad. And some of you will think it is. That's just how it works, and that's beside the point. It's amazing how in criticism, your likes can be a bigger strike against your credibility than your dislikes, especially here on YouTube, where liking thing is for stupids. And of course, we do have to write with a mind towards the algorithm. We do have to write with the algorithm. Wow. Negativity just gets more views. So for those of you to leave don't you like anything comments, I refer you to Jim Sterling's video on the same topic. It is surprisingly difficult to create content that will hit with a wide audience while not also being thing bad, which is partially why in my old age I'm more and more appreciative of films like Titanic, widely popular while also being sincere and generally hopeful. Who are you, arrogant man, to call yourself the king of the world? I am the king of the world. I am the king of the world. Woo! I think you re not. Man, remember when James Cameron got cancelled for that? Woo! James Cameron got cancelled for quoting his own movie at the Academy Awards, and Kate Winslet got fat shamed. Man, fuck the 90s. So I'm not saying that I'm not doing thing bad style content anymore because frankly, it is often fun to write. 10 years old. But it is an interesting challenge to do more exploratory topics, or in this case, thing good content. And who better to emulate in that regard than James Cameron? Woo! In many ways, the work of a critic is easy. We risk very little, yet enjoy our position over those who offer up their work and their selves to our judgment. We thrive on negative criticism, which is fun to write and to read. In the grand scheme of things, The average piece of junk is probably more meaningful than our criticism designating it so. So you remember like 6 months ago when I said this is going to be the shameless self-promotion section of the channel. Well, here's what month it is. This was supposed to be a lot more fun. This is all your fault. That's it. That's all she wrote. I'm the king of the world. Julian, you shut up. Shut up. Now let's knock this motherfucker out of the park. Wear it until you love it. Where is me beautiful sister? Fuck you. Wait, bro. Fuck you and all your hateful people. God damn it. Ah, 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 ah. Sit in there like a fucking baboon. No, no, no. Do, 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 do. I hate fucking whiskey, son. I couldn't stop at fucking 3 or 4. I defy you stars.